let me talk about what I see as the most important things happening in the world, which may not be what the newspapers are carrying, but there are two things. The first is the massive desynchronization of the world's economic system. The United States has now grown by 5% a year. The Europeans, on the whole, are not growing at all. Southern Europe is in depression with extraordinary unemployment rates. The Chinese have lost the edge. Their wage rates are so high that it is cheaper to manufacture in Mexico today than in China. The Chinese are undergoing massive political purges. The Chinese Communist Party is struggling to stay in control. The vision of the world as a small place with everybody moving in tandem is simply not true at this point. And the truth of the matter is that the two most important regions of the world, which together make up 1/2 of the GDP of the world, Europe and the United States, are moving in absolutely opposite directions. The American growth rate is extraordinary, considering how wrong all the economists were back in 2008 as to what would happen. But what's the most important thing about the American growth rate is how it contrasts with the European. And I want to talk a little bit about Europe. Because Europe is in a way the center of the global civilization. And Europe is involved in a great experiment. The 20th century was a catastrophic century for Europe. It lost its empire. It slaughtered over 100 million people politically in wars, starvation. Can it somehow live in peace? The entire experiment of the European Union is not only an experiment in prosperity, but an experiment in the idea that that prosperity will end the endless wars in Europe. And that is what is at stake here. And that towers over just about everything else that goes on in the world. The simple fact is that ever since 2008, Europe has been in an economic crisis that it's not been able to solve. It's not because some think tank hasn't figured it out. It's not because the policymakers haven't thought through what they might do or not do. It hasn't been any of these things. The fact is that they haven't been able to solve it because it's insoluble. And the basic reason it's insoluble is that Germany is addicted to exports. Now, this will get back to Texas, but give me a minute here. Germany derives the equivalent of 50% of its GDP annually from exports. Its industrial base is so huge that it can't possibly survive just on domestic consumption. Europe must have the free trade zone. Europe must be an exporter, and it must have access to all these European markets. As a result, the other European countries are staggering under the burden. They can't compete with Germany. They're overwhelmed with German products. They can't develop their entire industry. This led to a massive sovereign debt crisis. Since they couldn't compete, they couldn't pay their debts. That led to a banking crisis. And there was a question asked in Europe. Who should pay for this debt crisis? Should it be Germany, that benefits from it, or should it be the poorer countries? And the Germans nominated the poorer countries. And so you have a situation today, as you see in the map, where Southern Europe, the area south of the Alps, south of the Danube, is in depression. The unemployment rate in Greece today is at 25%. The unemployment rate in southern Italy is about 20%. The unemployment rate in Spain is 25%. To try to understand what that means, to have an unemployment rate that large, the unemployment rate in the United States at the worst point of the Great Depression was 25%. Southern Europe is in the same condition in many ways as the United States was in 1932. While you read the Financial Times and you hear the banks are okay, well, I'm not sure they are, but you hear that. What is not being noticed is that Southern Europe is being devastated. It is undergoing a wrenching crisis, and that crisis isn't going away. It's getting worse. It's spreading. The problem of free trade is that it's theoretically a wonderful thought, except in application. Germany became the power it is today because the United States permitted it to protect its industries in the 1950s from American competition while giving access to the American markets to the Germans. We didn't do that with nice guys. We needed the Germans to be strong against the Soviets. But the point is that Germany, Japan, these other miraculous powers that are now in favor of free trade, weren't created out of free trade. To give you a sense of the situation in Europe, imagine if at the center of NAFTA, the United States would be exporting 50% of its GDP to the rest of the world, half of it going to Mexico and Canada. Imagine the condition of Mexico and Canada under these circumstances. Well, the United States is a net importer in NAFTA, and so it doesn't work that way. But in Europe, that's the way it's working. One of the things that happens when you're really poor and you get poorer is you know how to be poor. The depression that's hitting Europe is a depression against government workers. Now, we all know we don't like government workers. They're lazy and shiftless. Some have to say government workers is okay. In Greece, a government worker is a doctor. Healthcare is nationalized. He's an engineer. He's an architect. The government encompasses huge parts of the economy. So what is being devastated in Europe is the professional class. When a poor person gets poorer, he understands what poverty looks like. When a doctor or an architect has its monthly salary cut from 3,000 euros a month to 800 euros a month, he's still technically employed, but he can't keep his house. He can't plan the future he wanted for his children. He's not going to live the way he expected to live. And as it became clearer and clearer that there is no solution to this problem, the bitterness of the realization of a 40-year-old professional that he is never going to have the life he thought he was going to have turns political. And it turns into the politics of bitterness. And you see now in Europe the rise of right-wing parties. Partly, you see this in the anti-Islamic sentiment in Europe, which preceded the recent events and feed on each other. But partly, it's a bitter and deep resentment against the European Union, and particularly against Germany, whom they blame for their problems. The very question of free trade is at stake in Europe. From the German point of view, everything is fine. If you look at that map, German unemployment is in low 5%. Southern European employment is 10, 20, 25, some cases close to 30%. This in Europe, not in the third world. And you have a rising movement that wants to close borders, not only to keep out Islamic terrorists, but to keep out the foreign workforce. French workers going to Germany. Imagine the United States if we closed the borders to make sure that people from Oklahoma couldn't come to Texas. Well, that may be okay, but But the basic idea of the American Union is that we move freely, both goods and services, and people especially. In Europe, there is a tremendous movement right now to close those borders. To close those borders so that the jobs in France are not taken by Italians. The jobs in Denmark are not taken by Poles. In other words, before our eyes, the very concept of the European Union is in its own way evaporating. You really have to understand the importance to this of the world, because Europe, taken as a whole, has a higher GDP than the United States. The creation of a massive political crisis in Europe destabilizes the entire world as Al-Qaeda never could. Al-Qaeda could be nasty, vicious, and a pain. It will kill people. It is horrible. But it doesn't lead to wars like the First World War and the Second World War, and the Napoleonic Wars. The danger of Europe is that the great promise of peace and prosperity is being destroyed as the prosperity is being destroyed and the peace is being destroyed.